We're here today to talk about the Workflow Committee, one of BISG's 5 standing committees, its work in 2021 and where we stand on some of the projects that are underway. Before we start that, I just wanted to remind everybody that BISG as an organization was created 45 years ago to create a more empowered, informed, and efficient book industry. And we work to try and solve problems that affect more than one part of the supply chain. We have 4 core objectives. These include information to establish BISG as the information hub for the book industry supply chain. In the area of standards to foster development, refinement, and use of standards, and particularly with a filter to improving revenue, promoting product visibility, reducing expenses, ensuring transparency across the supply chain. We conduct research that shapes the conversation about both the current state and the future of book publishing. And we look at emerging topics, issues, and trends when we try to pick those projects. And then more recently, last December, the board expanded our community objective to more specifically focus on inclusion. And that is now set to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, both within BISG and ideally across all segments of the book industry supply chain, something we're continuing to work on and work into. When you take those 4 goals together, they ideally create a virtuous cycle with standards providing a basis for research, that research generating information, and that information being useful to the community as a whole. That's the ideal model, and we continually work to perfect it. Excuse me. The things that our work does ideally is to solve problems that would have otherwise increased costs, lowered revenues, or blocked the development of new models. We try to ensure that information is widely available and transparent so that it can inform decision-making across the supply chain. We also try to improve the timeliness and accuracy of supply chain information, both provided and derived. And we give all of our members a voice in setting standards and best practices. We're really set up to assess and ideally resolve complex problems. We have a few as examples at the top, and those typically are assigned to 1 or more standing committees. The 5 standing committees shown here are metadata and identification, supply chain rights, subject codes, and the subject of today's conversation, the Workflow Committee. We also have some ad hoc working groups that sometimes are put together often or most often under the direction of 1 or more of these committees. BISG gives its members an opportunity to do several things. The first is to support the industry through membership, sponsorship, and research. The second is to gain access to information that improves how they operate. That is also membership attendance at events like this one, as well as in-person ones when we're allowed the luxury once again of having in-person events and participating in a variety of ways. And the last piece, and the most important, is to shape the ongoing conversation about book publishing, largely through participation through events, products, committees, working groups, and our board of directors. Committee work really embodies our values. I mentioned the 5 standing committees a moment ago. They're all staffed by member volunteers and led and chaired by individuals who volunteer their time to help shape each of these agendas. And it's a great opportunity for how our values are put together and amplified. Today, we're going to focus entirely on the Workflow Committee. That particular committee was actually created in 2018, and it follows the Content Structure Committee. Content structure had been focused on EPUB and accessibility, and this committee still does work with those topics fairly closely. But we wanted to find kind of a lower common denominator, and Workflow opened us up to have a variety of different conversations about it. It's currently chaired by Rachel Comerford of Macmillan Learning. As I said just at the outset, Rachel's scheduled a vacation this week, and we're joined today by Dave Kramer. I'd like to welcome Dave.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And Dave is with Hachette Book Group and has been an active member of both Content Structure and Our workflow committee, but in particular, has been active within the W3C, which does really important work in areas that include EPUB and accessibility. The workflow committee itself currently has 61 members. It's our smallest committee, but it's growing. It started out in the area of 25. Last year, at this time when we reported, it had about 40. So it's grown by about half again in the intervening year. Its most active participants come mostly from publishers and industry partners, and we're looking to diversify participants as the agenda broadens. Certainly when we're talking about EPUB and accessibility as core topics, the publishing community plays a significant role. But as we talk about workflow, there are important contributions that can be made from manufacturers, from distributors, and from retailers. Each of our committees, each of the 5 standing committees, has what we call a charter. The charter consists of 5 core components: the current state of the industry in the area that's handled by the committee, the objectives longer term for the committee, stakeholder benefits for the work that's done there, deliverables. Those are most typically for the current year. That's certainly the case for this presentation today. And then blockers, things that might get in the way that both the board and the committee want to be explicit about, so that we are aware of both the positives of what we do and the potential roadblocks to getting it done. So I'm going to kind of walk you through for the workflow committee each of those components. So the current state for the workflow is that this is a statement that kind of oversees the overall charter. The best practice when it comes to workflow is not defined, and cross-segment workflows may not deliver on requirements to deliver a timely, efficient, or transparent outcome. The other piece of it is that the impact of working remotely, and this is very specific to 2020 and now 2021, the impact of working remotely has made the importance of effective workflows more visible, and the need for best practices in this area is growing. We see this in a variety of different ways. I think everybody could tell a story about what's happening with respect to workflow in their own areas, as we've kind of gone to away from an office with shared facilities, that much more of the information has to be put online, and how we manage that and how we manage it effectively has been a part of an ongoing conversation within the workflow committee. The objectives are 3. These are the broad multi-year or governing objectives. The first is to promote BISG examples of effective workflows within and across segments. The second piece is to document best practice. We did this first in a white paper that was released in 2019 to kind of define and explain what workflow meant, and also to identify the tools and resources that are required to improve approaches that are already in place. The last piece is to maintain workflow-related guides and best practices to ensure that BISG resources address current and anticipated industry opportunities and challenges. And you'll hear about a couple of those products in today's update. The benefits of what we do are 4-fold. The first is to provide access to what we feel is best practice and alternative resources. Hopefully we close information gaps, and that it's in and of itself can foster best practice. We try to increase awareness of available tools and how they can help. And the last piece is that we lower costs, improve product quality and functionality, and improve time to market. Those are the outcomes of implementing best practices and the tools and resources that support them. We have for this year 6 overall deliverables. 2 of them, the first and third, are updating field guides, one to fonts and ebooks, and the other was updating a guide to the fixed layout for ebooks. The dates on this were actually set in the charter, and I haven't changed them, but we're actually delivering them later than this for a couple of different reasons that we'll talk about in a moment. The second one here, to evaluate the need for an update to recommendations for educational standards and objectives and metadata. This is what we call the educational taxonomy. It was initially written in 2015 and updated in 2016, but it's not been adopted by any recipients in the supply chain. We're trying to create a market there. We think particularly with more work being done, and it was evident with schools being offline in 2020 in particular, that there's a lack of information about how particular books in education meet educational objectives. This standard would have helped in that regard. It does need an update from its last review in 2016. We're just reluctant to undertake it until we can make sure that there's a market there. The fourth here is to lead a workshop on best practices for accessible metadata. That actually took place in June, and we'll talk a bit about that. We want to finalize and publish workflow tools and resources that have been targeted for August. It's going to be later this year. And then the last piece is to create a best practices guide for audiobooks. As you probably know, the W3C introduced in late 2019 a standard for audiobooks, and we're trying to work with that to and also to build on something that BIC, Book Industry Communication in the UK, has done to promote a better awareness of how to actually go from theory to practice in implementing the standard. So we'll start with the first publication, the Field Guide to Fonts. The initial product dates back to 2014. The first version was updated in 2015, but it hadn't been touched since then. The next version has already been updated, and it was copy edited in the spring, and we're formatting it now in the EPUB, and a PDF of that particular product will be published this fall. So you'll see an updated version of Field Guide to Fonts that will it was a fairly popular product when we first introduced it, and we just want to make sure we gave it a fresh look for 2021. The second piece, and I mentioned a bit of this a moment ago, the education taxonomy was developed by BISG in 2014 and 15. It's actually available for download at bisg.org. It's free. There's no expense associated with it. If you're a non-member, just set up an account. If you're a member, use your account and you can get a copy of it. It was created to help senders, the publishers, and recipients identify content that of an educational nature that would help build discovery and the use of that content. It could be particularly helpful for people who are working in remote learning environments. But the implementation is unclear. As I said, we had a recipients summit in February, and we hope to get a consensus that, yeah, this would be something that if you updated it, we would implement it. And we didn't hear that clearly. So we're trying a couple of different things, including plans for a survey of the education marketplace to see how it might be used to potentially jumpstart interest in and adoption of the taxonomy that was introduced. If there is that interest, then we will update it in 2021 or perhaps into 2022 at this point, and then release the implemented and updated version. The Field Guide to Fixed Layout Publications is also a BISG effort. It was first published in 2013 and was updated twice, once in 13 and once in 14. We had initially planned to release it this spring, but the W3C has been doing important work in this area on fixed layout publications, and we didn't want to jump ahead of them or create something that then needed to be updated. We currently have it on the schedule for update this fall. We'll be taking a look at it next month, and if we think it's ready to go and doesn't necessarily run the risk of being either superseded or made out of date by the W3C work, we'll release it later this year. And this is actually an effort that Dave Kramer's been active in. I don't know if you want to add anything, Dave, to the work that's been described.
Yeah, I sort of can't believe that this thing has been around for 8 years now. I think originally this was trying to fill what felt like a major gap. It's like, I sort of thought of the intended audience as, someone who was working in the production department of a small publisher who didn't have a lot of resources, and their management says, oh, we need to make a fixed layout ebook. And it's like, how could I convey to them, what they needed to know to get started, whether they were going to do it themselves or, just have enough information to talk intelligently with vendors or to respond to management queries. And so we needed sort of this primer, just describing the basics, how everything works, but also at a level of depth that you could actually see what's going on inside the files. And I think it proved to be kind of a useful thing. And then we've updated even with sort of feedback from, file recipients from Google Play and Kobo and so on, where they were telling us about, oh, we've seen these mistakes and we've seen how things can go wrong in these files. So here's what went wrong and here's how to work around it. And so I think that kind of sort of lived experience that got captured in the field guide was really valuable. Of course, the situation on the ground has changed quite a bit in the last 7 or 8 years. And, we mentioned a lot of possible future directions for how high design publications might work that haven't panned out. I think we also know a lot more about questions of accessibility. The W3C work that Brian mentioned was largely based on a task force of the EPUB 3 working group that was devoted to fixed layout accessibility, because by their very nature, fixed layout EPUBs, it's very easy to make them completely inaccessible. And so they've been working on some guidelines to at least improve that situation, which we are planning to incorporate into the field guide. So I hope we can sort of keep it on schedule and get this new version out this year.
Well, I hope so too, but as we had a chance to talk about even earlier today, that, our work does depend upon the contributions of a lot of people who are volunteering their time. And we're mindful that we have to be realistic about how much time and attention can be spent on these products. But I think, Dave, you've actually in that narrative touched upon two things that are really important to emphasize. The first is that things do change over these 8 years. I mean, just the growth of manga, and maybe if you're already a big fan of manga, that it doesn't seem like so much growth, but it's certainly much more visible today than it was in 2013. And I think that the importance of bringing a message to and capabilities to an audience that otherwise doesn't have the resources to kind of develop it on their own is an important part of what BISG is organized to do. It's not quite leveling the playing field, but at least making the best practice available to a wide swath of the industry. The benefit ultimately is with consumers, because they'll get publications that work right, that are accessible, that meet their expectations, much as and that only helps grow the industry. We have an ongoing interest in accessibility. Part of that is the legacy of the Content Structure Committee, and it was created and shared by Bill Castor of Publishing Technology Partners. The accessibility interest has only grown over time. It's become a more important topic, and you see developments all around the world, including notably in the EU, to make sure that publications are accessible. They have deadlines in place that are important, but it's also critical in North America, even with or without regulations, to deliver on the expectations of consumers. Part of the challenge for us is making sure that publishers create and transmit accessibility metadata, not the metadata itself being accessible, but metadata about accessibility features for products. We're trying to make the market between senders and receivers, and this is akin to what I was talking about with the educational taxonomy a little while ago. But the goal here is to give senders, publishers, a clear direction on what metadata is useful and how to communicate it, both in the file and in an Onyx feed for separate from the file. And then for receivers to show that there is value in that metadata being displayed, because it's of importance to anyone who wants to buy a publication to know what it is capable of. The rules have been kind of pretty well laid out in a variety of forms, but particularly by the W3C. And what we did was we planned and held a 90-minute workshop in the middle of June. That recording is, although it says here it's currently available to all BISG members. I think it's actually available to anyone who wants to hear it. on the BISG website. If you go to events and then watch YouTube videos, that there's a listing of all the videos that are available there. And it's a good conversation. Involve folks from Benetech, Red Shelf, and Rachel Comerford from Macmillan Learning, talking about how to approach providing metadata both within and outside of a file, what made sense and how it might be used. They also offered some really good case studies for improving discovery. Macmillan in particular has seen a number of problems go away because they've been more effective at providing and sharing metadata about their publications' accessibility features. We have a workflow tools and resources guide that we published in draft form in 2019. It has not been updated. The committee and staff have struggled with this a bit. Part of the issue is that workflow, like a little bit like the term supply chain, can be defined really, really broadly. And we're trying to find the right breadth and depth so that it, the tools are relevant to the audience that we have, but it's not just the tools that you know. I mean, we don't necessarily need to give an update on every aspect of InDesign as a tool. It's really well understood, but we can't cover everything that's available as a potential design tool that would support workflow and still get our jobs done. So we're planning for an update this fall that probably would be late fall. I expect November or December. And with any luck, it will be something more of a queryable tool, and potentially one that we would update on a more frequent basis with crowdsourced input and the like. And then the last piece is among the deliverables is the best practices guide for audiobooks. This is a new product, and new products typically within BISG take a little bit of time. BIC, which as you see as a note at the bottom, is Book Industry Communications, BISG's UK counterpart, has done some good pioneering work here to provide a best practices guide. We think this is an opportunity for two of our committees, workflow and metadata, to collaborate. And we also think it's an opportunity to engage the Audio Publishers Association. They are, by the way they're made up, they're not that keen about creating best practices guide, but they do want to cooperate and contribute if they can. We're hoping for this year, but that may take more time. And if it does, then we have to respect that. It's at the very least building on the work that BIC has already done. We think we can get something reasonably useful out relatively soon, but it's if it takes us into 2022, it's a function of just trying to maintain the quality there. And again, I think I said it in the introduction, but W3C kind of led the way here in introducing a standard or a recommendation that it introduced in late 2019, and we want to follow up on that and help them see greater implementation within the book publishing industry. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions. Maybe Jonathan, if there's anything that's come in.
Something has come in, just a very specific question, but just more generally, how organizations can get involved, non-members, especially with regard to audio book creation, because this is what's being asked by the Imagination Video Books. It's a nonprofit.
Well, the first thing I would encourage you to do is to be a member, because that's the easiest thing. But I recognize that sometimes there are two things with membership that are daunting. One is sometimes you don't have the budget for it, and the second is you might not have the time. But I'd say that I'm going to just jump ahead. I'll come back to these slides, but we actually have a slide on how to get involved. So the participation in committees and working groups is open to all members. And I don't specifically say it here, but I will for the purposes of the webinar. If you're interested, particularly in an audiobook working group, in all likelihood, we would create that as an ad hoc component of the workflow committee. And I would suggest write to us at info@bisg.org. That email goes to both Jonathan and to me. and just say that you're interested, give it, and that you'd like to be included. We do have and hold spots for what we consider to be subject matter experts, people who have expertise that we may not have in committee, or we may not have all the different examples of it. So we might have larger publishers and we want to have the voice of a smaller or medium-sized publisher or retailer or distributor. So just let us know and we'll make sure that we include you. That's an important part of what we offer. So.
Also, if I could get the contact information, I could put them in touch with the editor of the audiobook spec, who chaired the working group that created it. I think she'd be happy to talk when you read.
Yeah, exactly. We'll make sure that happens, Dave. So other questions are certainly welcome. I just wanted to provide a little bit of information on why our work matters. This I covered earlier. I mean, this is really central to the workflow committee. You know, we're providing access, we're closing information gaps, we're increasing awareness of what's available, and ideally our outcomes are lower costs, improved product quality and functionality, and shorter time to market. Those are the things that we try to use as our guiding forces. And as you look at any given topic, it's going to touch at least one of those. If you think about accessibility, that's certainly improving product quality, but it's also closing information gaps in this case, for consumers. The stuff that's happened this year, and we're pretty happy with it. We had a virtual meeting of recipients on February 4th. That was the recipient summit, and it was a good 6-hour meeting that covered a variety of different topics. We held the accessibility data workshop, the 90-minute workshop, in June. We've completed the field guide to fonts and expect to release it shortly, and we'll get the fixed layout publication out probably sometime this fall. We expect a new publication on best practice for audio content to come out this year, if not early next year. And we're still trying to think about how to move ahead on the educational taxonomy. One of the challenges I think BISG and other organizations that deal with supply chain issues face is that we're not taking advocacy on behalf of one constituent. We're not representing publishers or distributors or retailers. We're representing the supply chain. So we need to get people into a conversation about how to best move ahead. There's not always immediate agreement or understanding. So we're continuing to think through that, talk about it in committee, and I expect that, I don't think we've heard a firm no. I think we just haven't figured out how to get from point A to point B. The kinds of things that get in our way, and this is very much responsive to the question that was asked a few minutes ago. Subject matter knowledge is a big issue. I mean, often when we're in a committee, there might be one person or two people in the entire meeting who might know a particular topic well. That's good news in that they're bringing that information to a broader instance, but when you're trying to solve problems, that's a relatively thin base. So the information, the knowledge, and the resources may not be readily available. And sometimes that makes trying to figure out how to solve a problem harder. I mean, we need to have direct access to people who actually have solved the problem, or at least familiar with what the tools and resources are that might help solve the problem. And the other piece, and this is probably very true to anyone who's ever tried to change a publishing workflow, the willingness of people to try new tools and approaches is untested. I sometimes think it's bimodal. So there are people who will only try new tools, and there are people who will never try new tools. And I'm sure the reality is more complicated than that, but it sometimes is hard to figure out how to get uptake, particularly when you're crossing company boundaries. If you're working within a department or within a company, it's hard, but it's not impossible. If you're working across the supply chain, it's definitely hard. And it's it's trying to get even just the language to work is important to put time and attention to. Involvement, I talked about participation in committees and working groups, as well as reaching out to us to become a subject matter expert in one of our efforts. If you're interested in coming to a meeting and you're not currently a member, just let us know. I would be happy to have you come and test drive it to see if it's useful for you. Just specific to the workflow committee, our next meeting is on October 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Most meetings last, and workflow committees meetings are scheduled for an hour. Most of our committees are set up for 1 hour, and they meet typically in the second and third weeks of the month on a set schedule. So workflow is the second Tuesday of each month. Rights is the second Thursday, etc. You can see it on the BISG website. Participation takes place online. In person is fundamentally on hold during the pandemic. Online is always offered. We won't stop offering online even if we do go back to in-person meetings on occasion. We'll maintain that. It has been the case generally that we've been almost fully online in our committees since the beginning of 2017. We've been using Zoom since January or February of that year. Only the subject codes committee met in person and offered an online session. They've been entirely online since the pandemic started, but it's nice to see people and particularly colleagues and friends in person when you can, and it's also easier to make relationships. So we'd love to be able to get back to that, but I can guarantee, because we have a national and in some cases an international set of participants, we want to be able to support that with online. And if you're interested just on being added to the list of notices for committee meetings and the like, contact us. The address I gave you before, info@bisg.org, is a good one to use. It comes to Jonathan and me, and we'll follow up with you directly. I think we certainly have time for questions. I don't know if there are any others.
Probably not, but give it another 30 seconds to a minute. Please write in the Q&A box with any questions.
Thanks. And maybe while we're waiting for that, if I can prevail upon Dave, I mean, you kind of came to the workflow committee from after having done a lot of work with the W3C. I mean, what's your take on it? I mean, are we working on the right things? Is it kind of hands-on from your perspective, or is it a good mixture of both theory and practice?
I think it's a good mixture. I like that there's quite a broad range of perspectives, like not just people who work for publishers, people from a lot of different kinds of publishing. So,
That's true. That's a good point. Our members include education publishers. We have a startup in Kind World Books. We have larger publishers, Dave obviously working for Hachette, Rachel from Macmillan Learning. So it does kind of cover a wide range just on the publishing side, but we also have companies like Firebrand, Westchester Publisher Services, all participating actively in the committee.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's kind of fun going to the meetings. It's an engaged group. There's interesting people. We have fun sidebar conversations in the chat, and I come away learning things from the meetings essentially all the time.
That says a lot, because we all think that you're the guy who knows everything.
Yeah, that's so not true. But,
well, we have a couple more things that I just wanted to present, and if a question pops into your head, feel free to just add it. But beyond the workflow committee itself, we're working on a variety of other things. In any given year, we produce more than 24 webinars. This is one of them. We had this year 2 virtual events in place of things that we would have done in person. The first was our annual meeting in April. And we have an annual rights program. It's a 2-hour session on September 28th. We'll be talking about kind of broadband. What does the future of rights look like, and how are we working to kind of create it? We had the recipient summit discussion on February 4th. We're introducing 3 new, what we call coffee break webinar series that are focused on topics of rights, metadata, and workflow. I think each of them has a minimum of 4, perhaps 5 sessions. They're 30-minute sessions that will begin later this month for rights. But it's essentially just really focused topics. So rather than talking broadly about workflow, we're going to talk about specific aspects of workflow, EPUB, accessibility, formatting for fixed layout, things like that, that are generally boiled down to its essence in 20 minutes with a little bit of a window for questions. The first workflow event is scheduled for October 20th, and I would look for announcements. I don't think we've made an announcement for the series as a whole, but we'll be promoting the individuals. And even if you don't want to wait for the announcements, if you go to the BISG website under events, Jonathan has set up all of those events. And we also are planning to do about a half dozen product updates throughout the year, including the 2 that we've talked about today, as well as the third, a new one that we hopefully will get into 2021. Jonathan, I see a couple of potential questions, so I'll stop there and maybe field those.
No, right now we just have some high praise from our friend Tyler Carey, and a follow-up from the original questioner. So those are what's popped in so far, but nothing new to tackle.
Feel free to read Tyler's words verbatim because he only speaks the truth.
Well, Tyler tells us, great job, Ryan and Dave, really well done, especially the commercial to recruit more participants, which we would love to have on the workflow committee. As Brian says, it's growing, but it could still use more people. So if you're interested, please send us a line, as Brian said, to info@bisg.org.
Yeah, and Tyler has a good supply chain session coming up, sponsored or done in conjunction with Publishers Weekly. I don't have the dates in front of me, but maybe if he's still on, if you can just add the date for that event. It's at 11 o'clock, I think, on a Tuesday coming up. I'm not quite sure if it's the 28th or not. He's actually saying it's October 4th at noon. So that's a good event. If you look up Westchester Publisher Services on LinkedIn, I'm sure they have one or more promotions for it. And if you're having trouble locating it, just let us and we'll know, and we'll weigh in. I mentioned that we do quite a few webinars. This is just the upcoming calendar webinars between now and October 12th. So really just a month from now. And we're doing next Tuesday a conversation with the Urban Libraries Council, Kelvin Watson, who's a member of our board, and the librarian for the Las Vegas library system. And I are going to be in a conversation about what are urban libraries and how do they operate, what specific needs they have, and what can organizations like BISG and the publishing industry as a whole do to work better with them. That kickoff event in that coffee break series of rights is on September 23rd. It's Why Should I Care About Rights? We have a sponsored webinar from Clopatech on the 28th on how to manage and maintain your audio metadata. There's a coffee break webinar on the 29th, so the day after, on essentially Metadata 101. That's the start of that series. We'll have a supply chain committee update that's akin to this one on October 5th, and a second session in that rights series, how do rights work, and then specifically, let's make a deal. The September 23rd event is actually going to be interesting because it's going to be introduced with a conversation between Chris Kleeman, who's the chair of the rights committee, and Richard Sharkin, who had been head of Bloomsbury and is now recently formed Mensch Publishing. And he's going to be talking about his perspective that essentially all of publishing is a rights deal, and that in offering a number of different examples about why publishers should spend more time and attention on rights. And then last in that that single month is the strengthening the publisher to author relationship with a royalty statement portal, kind of a rights focus. It's sponsored by Fidel and will include Paul Gore, also a member of the BISG board, and another member of the Fidel staff. And then that program I talked about is on September 28th. That's a 2-hour program starting at 10 o'clock. It's Making Rights the Publishing Opportunity of the 21st Century. We think we have a pretty good case to be made, and we have about 5 people that will be contributing 3 different perspectives on that. If you're interested in more information, I was Dave, although he was kind enough to join us today to represent the hard work of the committee. I'm not giving you his email, yeah, but rather Rachel Comerford, who's at macmillan.com. She's the chair right now. Brian and I, or Brian at BISG and Jonathan at BISG get us directly, and info at BISG gets both of us. The website's a really good thing, especially events and resources. And we actually still pick up the phone. We figured out a way to have the phone ring on our cells. And so even if we're not in the office, we do answer the phone. Believe it or not. I'll stop there for a minute and
if anybody wants to chair the committee, talk to Brian.
that's true. And I think, is that so there's a gentleman interested in accessibility, but one last call for questions. And if not, then we'll wrap up and look forward to seeing you at one of those. I think there's 8 different things going on between now and October 12th. All right. Well, thank you, Dave, for coming today. I really appreciate it, and for being a steadying force in the webinar. Jonathan, for taking the questions, and to everybody who came today for both listening and contributing your thoughts and comments. We'll look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming events.
And many, many thanks to Brian for making all of this possible.
All right, everybody, take care.